Mahaba. Thank you for joining NBN's second digital salon. I am your host, Ms. Mitchell. We're broadcasting live in this cozy podcast studio in Washington, D.C. So today we're watching the global power map being redrawn real time. The war in Iran is essentially choked off the Strait of Hormuz, and the geopolitical ripple effects are slamming right into the Indo-Pacific region. So today, I have the absolute privilege sitting down with my good friend, Randy Shriver. Randy is truly one of the leading policy minds in Washington when it comes to China, Japan, Taiwan, and Indo-Pacific. I'll tell you a bit more about Randy. Randy has shaped the U.S. strategy at the highest levels, and he has served senior roles in both State Department and at the Pentagon. Today, he is the chairman of the Institute for Indo-Pacific Security, IIPS, and chair of the bipartisan U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. So, Randy, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I should take you everywhere with me. That's a great introduction. Thank you. Very kind.
Thank you. And we're going to dive right into the breaking news today. We're in Washington, just a few blocks down in the White House. The Japanese Prime Minister, Sane Takaichi, is visiting President Trump. And they just had a meeting. We had a press break. She told President Trump that President Trump is the only person who can achieve peace across the world, and she immediately condemned Iran. We have the clip. Let's take a look.
でイランに関してはもう核兵器の開発、これは許されてはならないことですから、日本も働きかけをしてきました。
And speaking of the situation in Iran, Iran's development of nuclear weapons must never be allowed. And that is why we, Japan, have been urging them and also reaching out to other partners in the world.
Mr. President, are you fully satisfied with the level of support that you're getting from Japan on Iran, including around minesweepers?
We're going to be speaking about it today. We've had tremendous support and relationship with Japan on everything. And I believe that based on statements that were given to us yesterday, the day before yesterday, having to do with Japan, they are really stepping up to the plate. Yes.
So, in the meeting, President Trump also praised Takaichi multiple times and congratulated her on her win in the election.
Yeah.
And the interaction between the two of them this morning, I think it can be better. It's a very delicate diplomatic dance. Prime Minister Takaichi, before she came for China, basically, because the president was going to China at the end of the month. But then Iran happened. So how do you see her visit this time? And what's the best can she deliver for Washington?
Yeah, well, she's coming in a very strong position, as you mentioned, the election victory. And for those who don't follow Japan as closely, I mean, this was truly a historic landslide for Prime Minister Takaichi and the LDP. So she comes in from a position of strength, which, of course, President Trump respects and admires. You are also correct that this is a relatively new issue for them to navigate. It was going to be a discussion about China, but look, even Iran has something to do with China. China is obviously the number one purchaser of Iranian oil. Something like 85 to 90% of Iranian oil is going to China, and they're still finding ways to get through the Strait of Hormuz with the assistance of the Iranians. So it's not unrelated, but yeah, I think Japan's immediate concerns right now are the increased costs of energy and what that's going to mean for the economy and the prospects of her economic plan, how they can support the United States as an ally. You mentioned her declaratory statement about condemning Iran. Probably President Trump will be interested to know if there's any other material contributions Japan is able to make on the effort, although we may be nearing a point where the military aspects of the operation will wind down. It's President Trump to lead into kind of a 2 or 3 week time frame. So I anticipate all those conversations will be had behind closed doors. But really, Prime Minister Takaichi wants to land a few points on China. And so I think her concerns will navigate back toward that because this visit with Xi Jinping was delayed. It wasn't canceled.
Right. And actually, they also touched upon this. And President Trump said something to everyone's surprise. He publicly said when he goes to China, which he said the time is set, it will be in 5-6 weeks. And when he goes, he will sing Japan's prayers to the Chinese. And I think for Takaichi, this summit is probably already off to the right direction.
Yeah. Yeah, Japan has a bit of a neuralgia about U.S.-China relations going back to the 1970s. There's even a phrase for it called Japan passing, where U.S. presidents in the past have wanted to deal with Beijing and try to manage regional affairs, manage global issues even, notwithstanding the fact that Japan is the actual treaty ally. And so I think President Trump and the relationship that he has with Xi Jinping, we're a bit concerned that there might be a version of that with his visit to China, but I think if he's signaling that he'll bring Japan's interests to the table into the conversations and be mindful of the importance of the alliance, that is a very significant and positive step.
And we also saw reports already saying that Japan is going to announce a massive $40 billion deal for Japan's Hitachi to build nuclear reactors in Tennessee and Alabama. Do you think this is something that would help Japan to also gain its leverage with the U.S., basically its only formal treaty ally?
Well, back to the trade framework agreement that was struck, Japan made huge pledges, $550 billion US, I believe. And so the question since then has been, how does this get filled up? What's going to be in the bucket? And so that's a lot of money. And I think identifying particular projects at this point really helps kind of see that this will be implemented. Japan will remain committed to it. It's got to be viable commercially. It's got to help Japan's industry as well, and it sounds like this deal is right in the wheelhouse.
Yeah, and I before Takaichi left Japan for the trip, she's facing a lot of pressure internally, about how Japan should deal with the U.S. at this moment, and she said explicitly that under Japan's pacifist constitution, she's going to tell Washington what she can and she cannot deliver. And what do you think in terms of Japan's delivery this time? What's the bare minimum? Like the trade deals, some kind of ice sweeper? What would be something later today that both sides will be satisfied?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think her willingness to really kind of define the realm of possible is really important here because this is fairly niche, nuanced stuff to understand what Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution says, how it's interpreted, what the associated laws that have been passed through the Diet mean. But it still likely means that, well, combat's going on. Japan is not going to be deploying assets into the region alongside the United States. So that's an expectation that I hope everybody's in an appropriate place for that. But you mentioned minesweepers. I remember the first Gulf War, after the shooting war, the Japanese sent 4 minesweepers, which was a huge deal for them at that time. That was really first major out-of-area deployment since World War II. So there is some precedent, there is some muscle memory for how Japan can contribute and still remain consistent with their constitution. So I expect they'll be exploring that.
Yeah, and there's also an important aspect here. When we talk about Japan-U.S. security alliance and the region, Taiwan is something that we have to discuss. And the reason why the current state of Japan-China relationships is tense, partly because Prime Minister Takaichi's statement on Taiwan, she last year said, if Beijing invades, Japan will consider come to Taiwan's defense, and everything happened from there. So can you talk about how, like in this triangle, in the current situation, how should Japan work with the U.S. on the Taiwan issue?
Yeah. Well, I think China was upset because she said what she said about Taiwan constituting a survival threatening situation. And the language, it's not very good English translation. That sounds better in Japanese, I assume, but it is the language from the Diet legislation that allows Japan to then engage in collective self-defense. So that's really the key that caught China's attention. But the Chinese were already concerned about the direction Japan was going and the U.S.-Japan alliance was going. Japan has doubled its defense budget. They said they were going to do it in 5 years. They did it in 3. They've introduced counter-strike capabilities, which have the capability of striking mainland China. They've reinterpreted the Constitution, which then allowed them to talk about different roles and missions. So there's a lot that China is upset about when it comes to the direction of Japan and the U.S.-Japan alliance. And Taiwan is definitely a piece of that. I think much of this can be discussed behind closed doors, and really what the president and the prime minister need to do is direct the bureaucracies and the militaries to say this is a serious situation. We're committed to preserving peace and stability and deterrence. Therefore, we need to plan for a variety of scenarios. Probably doesn't do much good for Prime Minister Takaichi and President Trump to talk about a blockade versus an invasion, but to really direct the defense ministry and the defense department to say, we got to be prepared, and that runs the full gamut. We got to train, equip, we got to exercise, we got to plan for a variety of contingencies with Taiwan. And doing that is not because you're itching for a fight; it's to keep deterrence. So that's my hope.
Yeah, and also this war in Iran. I'm sure China is watching this very closely.
Yeah.
Every war the U.S. fights, they watch their playbook and everything. And given the situation, is this a stress test, on Taiwan's situation, and how do you see this war means for China?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things about that. They are definitely going to school on it. They always do, as you said in the question. But of course, it's not in isolation. You have what happened in Ukraine and the resistance of the Ukrainian people and defense forces. You have the situation in Venezuela, which was a quick decapitation operation, which probably the United States military is the only military in the world that could have pulled that off. But aren't they thinking, boy, wouldn't that be nice to do it in Taiwan and do it cleanly and do it easily? And now they have Iran. So I think from the Chinese, they're trying to get their hands and minds around all of these things and really kind of extract the relevant lessons of modern warfare and conflict and how it might apply to them. But I think in the immediate term, it probably gives them some pause and gives them some sense of how difficult these operations can be. That's Ukraine. How capable the United States military is. That's Venezuela. And to date, we would say Iran. And really how much they have to be able to do for a military that hasn't seen combat since 1979, the People's Liberation Army.
Right.
So I think Xi Jinping is ambitious, and there's no doubt that he wants to accomplish this during his lifetime. But he's also pragmatic, and he doesn't want to put everything China has worked for at risk unless he's sure that they'll be successful. And at this point, I think there's a lot of data, if you will, out there to call into question whether that assurance is really strong enough.
And of course, the highly anticipated visit by President Trump to Beijing is now postponed. He seems pretty confident that in 5-6 weeks they will make the trip. So now adding Iran to the agenda, when President Trump goes, how do you see this summit would play out? And how would Beijing, let's just put ourselves in their shoes, what would Beijing want out of this?
Yeah, I think for President Trump and the U.S. administration, they're hoping for a visit that focused primarily on trade and economic issues. They have this trade truce in Busan from last year, which gave us a temporary landing spot for tariffs, gave us commitments on export controls. The Chinese were going to keep exporting rare earths, critical minerals. We were going to suspend other implementing measures associated with 301 investigation on shipbuilding and on and on. So they basically reached a truce, but they said it's a temporary truce of a year. So I think President Trump wants something that's more durable and in place that will address all of that. I think the security issues will be on the table, but President Trump would likely not want to go into any sort of conversation that might need the Chinese to ask for some trade-off or some, compensating measure. So he said the Chinese can help open the Strait of Hormuz. Okay, if they do that, isn't there going to be an ask from the Chinese side? And the second part of your question, what does China want? I think they want some concession on a major interest of theirs, like Taiwan, like the South China Sea, like things we're doing with other allies in the region. And I think President Trump, I've seen him negotiate. I was with him in Singapore and Hanoi when he met with Kim Jong-un. And in Hanoi in particular, I saw him walk away from what he thought was a bad deal. And he said publicly at that time, sometimes it's better to walk away than take a bad deal. So I've seen him, assess what the other side is after and rejected. So I think if the Chinese are putting something on the table that's not acceptable, I don't think we'll get that kind of.
So maybe Taiwan should not be too worried. Would that be a bad deal for the U.S.?
Yeah, Taiwan, 24 million people against 1.4 billion people. They always sort of play nervous, right? And they have one major security partner, maybe one and a half if you would count Japan, but one major security partner. So obviously they take some degree of anxiety in play at any point when these meetings are taking place. But I think the track record has actually been pretty good, and that goes back to the first term. I think there's been enough continuing support on arms sales, a very large arms sales package, 11 billion plus at the end of last year. The ongoing military training, the Taiwan has its own trade framework agreement now, which has the tariff landing spot and the agreement on investment, etc. So I think there's been enough signaling back that we care and support Taiwan. But yeah, anytime they sit at the table, there's going to be a degree of anxiety about what can be agreed to while they're out the room.
Yeah, it is a very delicate situation now with this with the Iran war, and the U.S. having this, according to President Trump, this will end very soon. But do you think this strike, this war, boldens China in some ways in the region, or this is something that China will look at the capability of the U.S. military and say, hold on, maybe don't do that. Start meetings.
I mean, they can take both of those sort of impressions and absorb them simultaneously because both are true, right? I mean, in a way, the United States has been a country willing to pursue its interests through use of force. They would say consistent with law and interests and all that, but there are others who have different opinions on that. So we've now used force in Venezuela and Iran. We've used force in Yemen against Houthis. So we sort of set that as a precedent. And I think China, when it describes itself as a peace-loving country, now I do think sees a precedent for using force from their perspective for a legal operation of dealing with secessionist Taiwan. But I do think on the other hand, they're seeing a very impressive military display. Munitions are being depleted, and they're probably making some calculation of, what does this do for our readiness in the Indo-Pacific? But nonetheless, they're seeing a very impressive military display. They're seeing the evolving nature of war in Ukraine and how that's going to affect their campaign plan. So I think, and that doesn't mention the purges, right? So and the purging flag officers out of the People's Liberation Army like crazy. I think they're probably in a position now of pause and reflect, absorb all these things before they move. But if I'm wrong, that's a big thing to be wrong about.
Well,
We'll see. I'm pretty sure, in this state, China is being very careful. And on one hand, they're stressing a lot about diplomatic mediation, right? Like the Chinese special envoy to the Middle East has been traveling in the Middle East nonstop. And I think he was in Egypt yesterday. And then Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, just met with UAE's special envoy in Beijing yesterday. So they're consistent in playing this role of this neutral mediator, diplomatic talks and all that. But do you see this war in Iran, even if it ends next week or anytime soon, do you see this as some kind of beginning of a change of Chinese involvement in the region? Would this be a power?
Yeah. So I think we also have to acknowledge, yes, they've been playing this role of diplomacy and trying to promote peace. They're also the number one supporter of Iran in the world, number one purchaser of their oil, a lot of material support for security forces, internal and external in Iran. By proxy, China then has its imprimatur on the terrorist activities in the region, Hezbollah and Hamas. So the Chinese, they are in many ways at least complicit in Iran's activities over the last several decades. So I guess I'm making the point, this is not a peace-loving, peace-faring nation that all they touch is good and healthy and wholesome, and there's that other side of things. I think it sort of depends on a few things that we just don't know the answer to right now, which is what's the aftermath politically in Iran and what kind of governance and regime will be there, because China needs client states. They need compliant partners, and if this is some version of the mullahs and the IRGC, then they're probably back in business. But that's a little bit soon to tell. The other is, what does Israel do? And I think the United States might have an idea about how this campaign wraps up on the military side. The enemy gets a vote, and certainly Israel gets a vote. And so that'll, I think, say a lot to how other countries in the region that have been attacked and have absorbed missiles from Iran, but how they see things going forward. Is this going to revert into sort of more traditional Arab-Israeli tensions, or is this going to be, sort of a reset? Iran was, not held in high regard, and there's historic tension between the Persian world and the Arab world when it comes to Iran and the modern sovereign states of the region. So this could be a reset. There are things in there that could really, kind of send us sideways. And the Chinese will be opportunistic. That much we know. But what will that opportunity be? I think we need to learn a little bit more.
Yeah, and in terms of Iran, China is very practical.
Yeah.
We know for a long time Russia, China, Iran, this triangle relationship. But this time, do you expect to see that China will just work with the next leader in Iran? And how is this going to impact China's policy or behavior?
Yeah. Again, I think it just depends. I think they are remarkably flexible when it comes to working with all kinds of different kinds of regimes. They want somebody they can do business with, and whether that's a democratically elected leader, if that's a authoritarian figure, I think that they are, again, very flexible. For Iran, China was irreplaceably important. Did I just make up a word? Irreplaceably? Irreplaceable. They were extremely important, buying 85% plus of their oil, right? And providing other types of material support. Iran is less important to China. I think it's about 13% of Chinese oil, and they've been compensating.
Iran needs China more than China needs Iran.
Yes.
Basically.
So exactly. Yeah, you're saying it better than I am. And of course, you lose Iranian energy, and you've still got Russia that is desperate for continuing Chinese support in their campaign against Ukraine and willing to cut all
Right.
kinds of long-term cheap energy deals. So the Chinese can absorb this if this turns out to be an Iranian regime that is less favorable and can't do business with them, and the region's a little bit chaotic. I mean, they do need the Strait open because it's not just Iranian oil that they're getting from the region. They're getting natural gas, and they're getting oil from other producing states. But they will deal with the situation as the cards are dealt with them, and they'll be opportunistic. But I think we just need to know a little bit more about how this unfolds to know with specificity what they're going to do.
And speaking of China, playing this role of the stabilizing power in the region, I know you have, followed China so many years and watching how China grow its soft power, this propaganda overseas, building image and all that. And you just came off from a hearing this morning, talk about China's influence in Latin America.
Right.
How do you see China's current play globally, especially in the Middle East?
Well, they're very strong in the information space, and they spend a lot of time on developing the right messages, what they think are the right messages, effective messages, and then really flooding the zone in ways that touch as many people, elites, but also people in these regions. And what we're seeing now is a very active campaign against the United States. We're the dangerous party. We're the party that is might makes right. We're the ones operating outside of international law and norms, and even worse than that, we're a capricious power that can't be reliable over any period of time. So a bit reckless, and then losing interest. And so they're painting a picture of the United States that they want to be in contrast with their narrative about themselves, peace-loving, peacemaking. But there is that other side of what China's activities have really promoted in the region, which is a lot of instability and chaos. So we got to be out there telling that side of the story. I know that's part of your mission, just being objective. But that's where they're most active. When it comes to economic assistance, development assistance, the BRI type stuff, they've been less successful. I mean, they're active, but in terms of real sort of return on investment, is this gaining them leverage, gaining them influence? It's been more of a mixed bag. So I think what we're seeing, particularly at this early juncture with Iran, is a lot of information space activity, a lot of messaging, a lot of positioning. Whether or not they're going to follow through in other ways that will strengthen their soft power, strengthen their leverage, again, too soon to tell.
Yeah, I am going to, I think we cover a lot of grounds, and I know we have a lot of friends online watching us from other parts of the world, and also we have friends here in the studio. So I'm going to open the floor and see if we have questions from the audience that we can all discuss together. Here, Andres.
Hi, I'm Andres Ildes, the Iran editor at MBN. My question is actually about a bigger issue, not just Iran. The US and China are engaged in a titanic struggle over AI, especially in the region. We've seen this in the war. Data centers are now considered legitimate targets. It's become a really big, unexpected issue, perhaps. So I wanted to ask you about your view of how AI, the digital Silk Road, and so on, is increasingly a part of China's foreign policy.
You're absolutely right. It's definitely one of the leading edges of their engagement in the region. And we had a hearing and did some work on China and the Middle East last year. You've quoted some of our work, I think. And at one point, one of our commissioners said, "Oh, wait a minute, I get this. This is oil for chips." That's basically what this boils down to. That's probably an oversimplification, but I think we know that the countries in the region are very eager for this technology and modernization. They're very eager to, I expect they'd rather have access to both Chinese technology and the United States technology. But in many cases, we're still in the lead. Hard thing to measure, but I think we'd still be the preferred partner. And the question often is, our export controls, our diffusion policy, our willingness to partner with countries in the region at sort of what level of cooperation, what technology level. And I think the Trump administration has been a little more forward-leaning than maybe some had expected, which probably positions us well in the region vis-a-vis China. I mean, there might be some other concerns about control of technology as a global matter, but I think it's very actively in play, and it is something that the United States has to be on top of monitoring, but also adjusting policies accordingly. If we're restricting and holding back, but they're getting the same level of support from China, why not have it be U.S. and why not be actively engaged there? So I like the hand that we have, but we just have to play it smartly, play it well, and I'm pretty confident we can do that.
Thank you. Andres just had his Iran newsletter out this morning. Today actually is the Persian New Year's Eve, so very
Happy New
yeah.
Year.
So
do they have like the year of the horse that?
Oh, so this year is the Chinese Year of Horse,
Yes.
And for the Persian New Year, I'll defer to Andres about.
It's just another year, but under special circumstances.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks for what you're doing.
And I think we're gonna allow people to ask more questions to continue the conversation. Anyone in the room, or let's take a look on the screen. Are we getting any questions?
I'm answering all the questions anybody could possibly have, I think.
I know. It's really fascinating to put Asia, to look at Asia in the Middle East, the MENA context.
Yeah.
For us, we follow China, we do Asia for a long time, but at MBN, this is something that the region would look at China from a different angle. And now with this conflict, the situation is much more complicated.
Yeah, and there's linkages that it's not immediately intuitive to me. For example, in Southeast Asia, where you have a couple countries that are majority Islam, but certainly a strong presence throughout the region. There's been serious issues associated with boycotts of U.S. Iconic brands and stores and products because of our Middle East policy, right? And it makes no sense in a lot of cases, So an iconic U.S. restaurant chain brand is hiring local people, probably sourcing local food. So they're really only hurting themselves, but they have a brand that they can go after. So there are a lot of things that probably were underappreciated, underreported that links the regions together for a long time.
Yeah, that's why we're trying to add more coverage about what China's doing. They're great trading partners, but it also comes with a lot of other things as well. But we built this China tracker just a few months ago to track China's footprint in the region. And we look at military diplomacy, soft power, technology, all kinds of things, because it is an issue that the region should be able to look at the numbers and the stats to understand the depth of it. And
it's a great service.
Thank you. And it's all the team, all here. And one other thing I always want to discuss because of what we do, and going back to the soft power issue, and you just touched upon it. There are historic reasons in the Middle East with China, with Russia, with the U.S. And you think looking ahead, especially when the U.S. is becoming this mind of AI center, investing in the high-level AI technologies and stuff. Do you see the relationship between U.S. and its Middle East partners shaping in different ways? It is more tricky now with the war, but when we get out of this, or depending on how we handle it.
Yeah, depending on how we handle it. Well, yeah, I think we're sort of we're on a bit of a long arc where our interests were largely defined by reliance on the Middle East for oil, which is now less and less over time given U.S. domestic production and what's happening in the global marketplace, to a point now where there's mutual interest in investment in both directions, and sort of a different type. Oil's still important because we have partners and allies, and it is a fungible global commodity. But there's opportunities to kind of reshape and redefine these relationships. President Trump, if you look at all the parts of the world that he takes an interest in and cares about, he cares a great deal about the Middle East. And his record on, for example, the Abraham Accords and trying to bring more countries into that might be one of his strongest legacy issues when all is said and done. Again, we'll see how things unfold from the Iran campaign. So, again, a long arc, less dependency on oil, more acceptance of Israel with the U.S. playing a role through the Abraham Accords, and interest in investment and technology and all this. So yeah, I do see the potential for really reshaping the relationship with the region, but there's a lot of wild cards out there.
There are a lot of wild cards out there, and at this stage, it's probably too early to predict anything. But these are the talks, policy talks that that's why we like to discuss these different scenarios and stuff. And we have a couple questions from the audience, and one is from Abed, I believe. He asked, what has been the single most event or statement that surprised you the most in this conflict?
The single most surprising statement or
event, like.
Well, I think it's probably the first few days of the conflict, maybe even the first 24 hours, how quickly some of the major objectives were accomplished. I mean, that's pretty stunning, with the Ayatollah and much of the leadership. That was basically a single strike because they were concentrated. But the rapid way the Navy was decimated, the rapid way the ballistic cruise missile and the production facilities were destroyed. I don't want to say, lacking confidence in the U.S. military, but I mean, the speed is pretty remarkable that that was done within, 48, maybe a 3 or 4 day window. But I think that probably surprised me.
This is very interesting. I think everyone, not shocked, but everyone was looking at this like, wow, the U.S. does have that type of capability. And you, in your career, you have been in the White House Situation Room, probably every week when you're there. So what kind of discussion, like when you are launching a military strike like this, what are the things that goes on in the room that you talk about? And
yeah, well, I think the military is inclined to think about these things as campaigns, and the absolute interest in clear objectives and applying the means to achieving those objectives. So if you say, we're looking at decapitation operation of political elites, destruction of the Navy, destruction of ballistic missiles and their production facilities, got it, boss, we can do that, and we can apply the means, and, that's across the joint force and all that. I think the risk sometimes is people think the military, because it's so good, in a way you can be sort of victim of your own success and your own capabilities, right? Is that people start to think the military can have a overstated role in the political transformation of a country or the rebuilding or whatever. And sort of time and again, we've allowed mission creep, and we've allowed, the military to take on roles that's really not core to what the military does. So the hope is you have the military talking about the military campaign and what it can do and the means applied for that and what timeline, but the complementary discussion about what does that mean for the political future of the country, the diplomatic relations in the region, and all that. So, in a lot of ways, if it's done right, DoD's piece is the most clearly defined and the cleanest kind of part of the operation, particularly if it's through precision munitions and you're not contemplating
Right.
boots on the ground and all that. But we've had a historic challenge of keeping the military in that lane and not asking too much of them and not asking for things that are outside their core.
Yeah, and like you said, the military is the cleanest, but when it goes to the policy impact, the like how you play out, how China would react,
Yep.
EU would react. Actually, earlier today, in the press conference, not the press parade
Yes.
before the meeting, they kind of talk about it like, could give the allies a heads up.
Yeah. Well, that's a calculation that you make, and if you're anticipating coalition operations, particularly at an early stage, you probably would want buy-in as early as possible, preferably even before the strike. So advance notice, I think, in that case would be helpful. But it's not without risk. Operational security risk. The more people know, the higher the chances of some sort of leak or some, disruption to the campaign. It's just a calculation that political leaders have to make, and I think the military is inclined. Less people that know, the better.
Right.
They take operational security very seriously, and I think political people have to make that broader calculation. Do we want allies and partners brought in on the front end? Do we want to bring them on midstream? And they made the decisions that they made.
Right. And we're getting another question here about the Kirk Island. Karg Island. The President Trump has been talking about it. Is it likely still to happen, to take the island?
Well, I don't know the answer to that.
Right.
And I think my guess is it relates to information we will learn not over a pretty short period of time. What I mean by that is, are they anxious to wrap up the military campaign?
Right.
And I get the sense that the president is. He's looking for an off-ramp for a lot of reasons. And if that's the case, then we're probably not going to be in a position to take it. It also relates to the politics. If, the goal in Venezuela was to get a regime in place that would be more compliant and cooperative on a range of things like counter narcotics and counter illegal, illicit activity, human trafficking, etc., everything that was going on with the cartels. And President Trump is willing to have Delcy Rodriguez and the Maduro cronies do that for some period of time, right? As long as, and U.S. oil companies are allowed to go down there and check things out. So in a way, if we have a regime in Tehran for a period of time that, restarts the oil and is a more compliant and cooperative regime, then you don't have to take it. You don't have to do anything further, really. So there's just these variables. We need to know a little more, and I don't think that means months. I think it's probably weeks.
You think probably weeks? I think it was yesterday the president was talking about how he couldn't find anyone to negotiate
Right.
Iran anymore, and the new leader is nowhere to be seen.
Yeah.
It seems like it's a situation. Any moment it can change, but it's still very unclear.
Yeah, it does seem that the IRGC is intact as a fighting force and is imposing security throughout at least the Tehran area. So those guys will fight to the death. They'll
Right.
fight for their lives because they were benefiting from the regime. They were part of the security apparatus that oppressed internally. Those guys have nothing else to live for if this doesn't survive somewhat intact. So, I think there are scenarios where even if you don't have somebody of the stature of Khomeini and his son, that structure can promote somebody to, have a position of authority and some form of governance. But again, just too early to tell all that.
Yeah, I think we're going to have a long month ahead of us on how we wind down on the situation.
Yeah, and the enemy gets a vote. So if you look at the Strait of Hormuz, boy, that's tough geography if you're trying to survive a contested environment, because very few sea mines, very few rockets and shore-based missiles can close that thing down. And I remember serving in Desert Shield, Desert Storm. We had 2 ships hit mines in the sea. They were World War II era proximity contact mines, and boy, did that put a scare into the entire fleet that was operating in the Persian Gulf and areas around there. So you can do a lot to bring commerce to a halt and really create problems. So they get a vote. They can do that as a point of leverage. So even if we want to wind down, if they're sensing that it's unfavorable terms, they can keep stirring that up just long enough to try to improve the terms.
Yeah. Sorry, we get another question here. How do you assess the impact of Iran's proxy activities on the risk of inadvertent escalation, particularly in areas that include nuclear facilities or other critical infrastructure?
In the United States or in the region, or I think Israel, if you look at their campaign, they are going after the proxies while they're going after Iran. Does Iran have kind of a global network of proxies that might do sabotage or terrorist type activities in the United States? It's certainly things we're concerned about. I mean, if you look at some of the threats to some of our political elites, was Mike Pompeo, was John Bolton, was President Trump targeted by Iranian agents? I think there's some evidence that they were. So it's a risk, and it would sure be nice to have a Homeland Security reopened and funded and new.
Well, that's another.
I guess our secretary was voted out of the nominee, was voted out of committee. So hopefully they can resolve all that, because I think that's part of the architecture that helps keep Americans safe.
Yeah. Do you think at this point the proxies would have the same reach or determination to?
Very hard to measure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a known unknown, to use the
Right.
Rumsfeldian lexicon, right? If they see their main sponsor, basically on their knees and almost finished, then that's certainly going to change motivations and interests. But it's not, the risk is not zero. Let's just say that.
The risk is not zero. I think that's a very good phrase for that. And I have a couple more questions here. Just going back to the Indo-Pacific, if you had to define the current state of U.S. alliance in the Indo-Pacific, after this war, in just a few phases, like where we are now and what are the challenges looking ahead? How do you look at this now after this war?
Well, I think alliances have been a bipartisan project in the United States for a long time. And I think if you look at the Indo-Pacific across administrations, Trump to Biden, back to Trump, I think there's been a lot of investment and support for the alliances. Different approaches, and I think President Trump tends to look at the economic and trade issues as our own national security, our own national well-being, so that doesn't give you necessarily favorable or preferable treatment because you're a treaty ally. But I think if you look And our major allies, they're all in pretty good health, with Prime Minister Takaichi's visit this week. In Korea with President Lee, we're kind of defying gravity. We have a progressive government in Seoul and a Republican government in Washington. They're getting along famously, and we're talking about new areas of cooperation like shipbuilding. With Prime Minister Albanese in Australia, you had a great visit where they talked about cooperation in critical minerals and supply chains. President Marcos had a terrific visit here where they've expanded our military exercises. Balakatan, largest ever, for deploying things into ECTA sites. So it all looks pretty healthy to me. But, you know, challenges like the Iran war and the knock-on effects, particularly the immediate one, which is energy costs and raising the cost of living, you know, that throws another challenge into the mix. So we'll see.
We'll see. Well, thank you so much, Randy,
Sure. Thanks for having me.
your great insights today. And thank you all for being online. Shukram. Today's salon will be dubbed in Arabic language and post on El Hura News YouTube channel. And please do follow El Hura News website and our newsletters. Your support make our work better, and we'll see you next time.